Hello everybody and welcome to the 123rd edition of the Frank and Stan Chat. This week we have the guests of called Phil Naylor and John Stephens. John has been a guest with us before, and my partner in crime Stan is in North Wales. And the reason I'm recording this is because we had a slight technical hitch at the beginning of the recording, so rather than just re-record the whole thing again, I just decided to insert this little slot. So apologies for the slight strange beginning of this recording, but I hope it doesn't spoil your enjoyment of it. It's a really interesting chat, so I'd suggest that you give it a go. Thank you for watching. My old friend Stan Johnson as well. Hello, Stan. How are you?
Frank. We're just lucky to get a signal. I'm not sure how long it will last. I'm in Wales, packing up today to get back and leave the caravan then until next spring. So it's a bit of a clearing out and taking down and moving everything home.
Well, okay, let's go then to the guest who's been here before. Hello, John Stephens. How are you?
Hi, Frank. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. A nice, wet Manchester morning.
And Phil Naylor. Naylor's Natter. How are you, Phil?
I'm good, thank you, Frank. Morning, Stan. Morning, John. Thank you for inviting me. A real pleasure to be here. Big fan of the show. Watch it regularly on YouTube every week, listener. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, to have also a very successful author as well, Phil, amongst our midst. I mean, who would have thought when you started your Naylor's Natter it was going to lead to a book?
Well, I think we'll just go for author at this stage. Haven't seen the sales figures. Yeah, we'll just go for the author.
So is it just my sale? It's just my purchase. Is that
well, I tell you what, Frank, you couldn't do any more to support or help, could you? So I'm eternally grateful for everything that you've done to try and put that. I think the euphemistic term that's used by publishers, I think it's not found its audience yet, I think is the term that we use. But we know we remain hopeful. You never know, dude.
But I would say, if anybody watching or listening to this, that is well worth a read. It's called Naylor's Natter. And I mean, it might be a good way there, Phil, of you introducing, yourself through giving that a bit of a plug as well. So who are you, Phil, and why are you here?
Well, excellent. Yeah, I'm an expert at the shameless plug, as people who listen to the podcast will know. So that will undoubtedly come later. Who am I? So I'm currently, I always say, but I feel I've got to explain properly today. So I always say I'm a deputy head teacher in a secondary school in Blackpool, but I feel as though John Stephens is here, I'm going to be okay to say I'm deputy head teacher at South Shore Academy in Blackpool. And in terms of other things that I've done, so I started Naylor's Natter podcast in 2019 as a result of being appointed to the loftily titled Assistant Director of Blackpool Research School, a title that we made up because we just had carte blanche to do as we pleased at the start of that movement. And I knew, well, next to nothing about evidence and research-based practice. So I felt like the best thing to do is talk to some people who did. So 160, 170 episodes later, and then we had the opportunity to sort of pull all this together in hopefully what was going to be a couple of volumes of kind of an amalgamation of key themes from the podcast, which is the result of that. And this is Naylor's Natter, shameless plug. There we go. Look, there it is. Still available everywhere.
And I have to say, it's a great read because, I mean, you might not always agree with everything within it, but it does actually condense into sort of 5 or 6 main themes and draws on and not all of the discussions that you've had, Phil, but a number of them from some really eminent people that you've had on your podcast. So also there's a QR code in there as well, which I've used a few times as well, just to go straight to the episode. So that's the plug there done. I think we can leave that there. But John, thanks for coming back. So do you want to just do a little introduction as to who you are?
Certainly, Frank. So I'm John Stephens. I'm the Chief Executive of Bright Futures Educational Trust, and we have 12 schools and 2 teaching school hubs and a skit and lots of other things. We're based in the Northwest. One of the schools that we have in our trust is South Shore Academy in Blackpool, where Phil works, and that's part of a family of primary, secondary, including 2 special schools as well.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, well, it's great to have you here. And for me, this is the last day of the half-term break. I think it is for others as well. So I hope that means that 1 or 2 people can listen and watch this episode, you know, during a little bit of downtime, perhaps. So, well, it's been a very busy week. There's a lot going on. So should we go to Phil? Do you want to kick off with what's caught your eye this week?
Yes, thank you, Frank. Well, the big thing this week, as I know I spend far too much time on Twitter, as lots of us do, is, of course, the Blunkett Report, and the reaction to the Blunkett Report has been quite interesting across Twitter. So for those of you that haven't seen it, I'm sure that you've got the key headlines, because I know it's been picked up by TES and Schools Week, etc. So you've got the key headline figures, but it's been quite interesting to see that some people have come out in a robust defence of current policy and practice, and indeed founded yet more grassroots organisations. Sorry.
It might be funded.
I was just going to say, that was a Freudian slip there, wasn't it? I'll be careful what I say. But I've founded some more grassroots organisations in a defence of current practice, and then lots of other people that perhaps feel as if their voices have been sidelined slightly in the debate over the last few years have kind of come out in support of a lot of what has been read there. And I think that, you know, I'm not trying to pigeonhole myself as the, you know, the common sense classroom teacher and senior leader in school, but I think we'll find lots to agree with there. And I think we'll find things that, you know, potentially we don't agree with, but we could work together to try and come to some kind of sensible middle ground. And I said off air earlier on, for anyone who's shouting at the podcast now, I've had the pleasure of being described as blessedly non-partisan. So I'm okay. I can just sail through this educational debate without as yet being blocked by or upset any of the education major hitters on Twitter. So yes, really interesting report.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I have had some reaction to a comment that I made. As soon as it came out, I read it quickly. My view was that I was very much in favour of the general sort of direction, and it was quite disappointing how some of the colleagues that you were referring to there, Phil, grabbed hold of just one of the recommendations and then tried to sort of use that as sort of discrediting the whole damn thing, you know. And actually, I think I said, I mean, I have to say this, together with the Times Education Commission, which actually looks as though this government is going to start thinking about, might have some merit and to it, and this report have a much, I think, more positive way forward for education than the white paper, which I felt as though was very much sort of well-trodden path, you know, a bit more of the targets, make them a bit harder, that sort of approach. This has got a very different sort of feel to it, and I think we shouldn't sort of just kick it into the long grass because 1 or 2 sort of Twitter controllers is probably one way to describe it, you know, feel as though it might actually prevent them from having a say in the future. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, John.
Yes, I've not read the whole thing, a bit like you. I've seen some of the summaries and had a look at the bits that particularly caught my eye. But I think what was really encouraging for me was, regardless of what it says, it's really good to see some proper policy thinking going on and being put out there. So I found it a provocation. And from that point of view, that's great. It's great to have a provocation where people are putting something out there that we, all of us, as a community of educators and more widely, can get our teeth into, can have those debates, have those arguments, if you like, and tease out, you know, learn more in doing so about our own positions and clarify other people's positions and the thinking behind it. But what struck me in some of the reaction, and this often happens, is that you have a report that somebody's pulled together and it hangs together. So one bit of it is codependent on another bit of it. And if you just take one headline from it or list something cold, it's kind of, well, what's that about? What's that about? Well, it doesn't really make sense. It's a bit like listening to a song from a musical in isolation and not really getting its context and not really understanding what it's about. So I think, you know, it's worth spending some time on and some thought on, because I think there were some ideas in there that are at least worth debating. And I welcome this, that in this space, there's some policy thinking. It made me think something I used to think a lot about when I was responsible for making policy, that you would make these grand national ideas. And I always used to think, I wonder what that looks like in a classroom on a wet Friday like today. I wonder what that looks like. What's the connection between the two? And how can we go about finding out and seeing actually if what we intended is the consequence in the daily lives of children and young people, and of course people who are working with them.
I think one of the things, I mean, Phil, you're probably in a good position to comment on this, is that some of the criticism has been picked up on one of the aspects around collaborative work, hasn't it? You know, as opposed to the more direct style. And I found it quite interesting that a drama teacher tweeted this morning to say, well, hang on a minute, you know, I don't think actually a direct style is really going to work in my drama studio. You know, obviously there are elements of direct instruction, but actually the sort of investigation and the development of that is often done, you know, in small groups. But actually I felt as though there was, I don't know about you, but when I've gone around schools, I'm not seeing loads of collaborative work. It's not the, I mean, I do see it, don't get me wrong, but I think they've some people try and give the impression that all the young people are doing is just sort of like sitting around a table or having a bit of a discussion about what we ought to be doing. You know, I mean, that is so far away. In fact, some of the schools that I've been to, there's been far too much direct instruction, you know, actually, and that's affected in a way the learning. But in a way, it is around the toolbox thing. You know, there are times when the direct instruction feels right. You know, probably whether it should happen all the time, I'd probably say no. But similarly, you know, sort of collaborative work always going on without direct instruction, that probably is a no-no as well.
So it reminded me of some work that was done by Maurice Galton, who was at Leicester University and subsequently at Cambridge in the 70s, in the mid-70s, when there was this sort of crisis. Everybody was doing all this very free work. So what Maurice did with his team was launch the Oracle project, where they went and spent a lot of time in classrooms looking at what was actually going on. One of the questions they asked was, what are the children actually doing? What are they learning? How worthwhile is it? Those are the first 3 of 6 questions in the framework. And actually what they found was, particularly in primary schools, there were lots of children sitting in groups, but actually working individually, often with direct instruction or interaction with texts.
Right.
And this kind of panic that there was this kind of unstructured work going on all the time just wasn't what was happening in classrooms. And it was a very large sample, and the work continued well into the 80s. And it's, you know, it's a really interesting project. And I often think about it, that gap between what we think is happening, what policy might say, and all those things, and actually, you know, Oracle observed classroom evaluation, and a great and rich theme of research, people like Dr. Pat Ashton, Maurice Galton, and many others who were, you know, great exponents of actually what is actually going on here, what's being learnt, and how worthwhile is it. That's where the evaluation comes in.
So Phil, do you have a view then as to, is there, are you going to sort of tread this sort of middle path here, you know, with regard to this? Is it just, you know, you've got to have a variety of approaches and you've got to use them at the right time?
I think we all do, Frank, don't we? I think that's the reality. I think that, you know, you could listen to the big voices on Twitter and you will get a lot from that. And, you know, and I've benefited hugely from that, having spoken to a lot of them. But I think the line that set people going was reformed, creative and forward-looking curriculum, which was interpreted in various different ways as a return to I don't know if it would be entirely or a more progressive approach to education. But then you talked about, you know, group work or, you know, working in, you know, with peers, etc. I teach science. I can't do direct instruction all the time. You know, we have a set number of required practical activities that, yes, I may need to lead from the front to explain, but actually the process of doing that will involve collaboration. It will involve creative work. It will involve working with others. And, you know, that's always been the case in the subject. I think that quite a lot of the reaction, I don't know what everyone else thinks about this, was from primary teachers who felt that perhaps there does need to be a return to something a little bit more, creative and forward-looking. And they were talking a lot of some of the stuff that I've read about the amount of stuff that's in the primary curriculum. And it's kind of stifling that creativity or not allowing them to express that because there's so much content to get through.
Yeah. I mean, I as a primary person, I'm more concerned about secondary, to be honest. I really am. But yes, and the place of some of these subjects, that seem to be sort of going somewhere else. They're not featuring. I mean, we could talk a lot about this because there was also a reveal about how schools are actually how narrow the school curriculum is for some pupils, which was revealed I think in the last week or so, which to me seems very, very odd. But anyway, let's move on. We have probably another discussion for another week. John, what's caught your eye this week?
So I don't know whether anyone's noticed, but we've had another Prime Minister this week.
Yes.
That caught my eye. It's happened more frequently than it used to. It did catch my eye. But one of the things I thought was great about the first speech that was made by the Prime Minister, there were two things that were said. First of all, education got a mention, which I thought was great, and I think it sets the tone that that's going to be a priority, at least for the near future while this administration continues. And that was great. It's great to hear that mentioned. And the second thing was the focus on integrity. And that's important, particularly to me and to our trust, because it's one of our core values. But one of the things I always say about it is words are cheap. You can talk about integrity till the day is long, but actually you have to measure the actions you take and inform the decisions and actions you take by reference to integrity, and really explore that and be prepared to defend what you do on the grounds of integrity. And I think for me, that's where the rubber hits the road. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges. If you say that, and I say it, so I know that this applies to me as much as to anybody. If you say it, you've got to be prepared to be judged by it, and people will come back to you and say, well, you talk a lot about integrity. When you did X or when you took decision Y, where was the integrity in that? And we talk a lot about this in my organization. Sometimes when we're about to do something, or if we've done something, where were our values in that? And actually, did we really pay close enough attention to them? And if we haven't, how can we put it right? And if we have, how are we going to stand and defend that if we're asked to?
So not naming names here. So if you had a member of staff who was dismissed for breaching a very serious bit of information, shall we say, to somebody outside of your organisation, and you dismiss them, they were actually sacked for doing that. How would you feel if, say, a new CEO came in, John, and within about 6 days that person was re-employed?
Well, I think, again, the question would be, where's the integrity in that? In that action, how are you upholding that core value? And you'd have to explore that with them, wouldn't you? You would have to. And I personally would find that very hard to defend. And actually, I'm much more, sometimes people have to take pragmatic decisions. And I'm much more interested in people giving account for what they do by telling the truth about it and saying, look, I've got some balances to make here. I've got to do this and I've got to do that for these reasons and for the overall good. And this is the reason behind my thinking. And, we'll have to see how it works out. I like that kind of conversation. I don't expect people to be perfect. Wow. You're stressing yourself up, wouldn't you? But you don't expect perfection, but you do expect thoughtfulness, reflection, and this thing called integrity.
Yeah.
And giving account to people.
Yeah, I mean, that transparency thing seems to go with integrity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's why, and it brings us to the question of collaboration, doesn't it? So one of the things that my trustees do very well is push the thinking. I talked before about provocation, and I've got a group of people around the table who provoke really good thinking. So I might present something, or a colleague might present something, And they will say, well, let's flip that around. What if you did the opposite of that? And they help us by those conversations to test out whether we're doing the right things at the right time and whether we're working to the values that we profess. And I found that incredibly helpful.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, Stan, what's caught your eye this week?
I'm not sure how stable this signal is, Frank, because you're all frozen on my screen.
You're still there, Stan. We can still see you.
Am I still there? Well, just like John, integrity is one of our core values. So we have to live by that. And the company, honesty, transparency, and integrity are our three core values. And if we don't react and work with schools in a way that shows that we have integrity, they have every right to say we're walking away. You don't do that. And we work with our schools on a basis that it's a pay-as-you-go service. So we have to show that integrity if we're going to keep the people who want to work with us and who we want to work with. Mm. So I do think integrity it was a core value when I did you do one of these 360 evaluations of your own values. Actually, integrity came top in mind from, in fact, I have a feeling, embarrassingly, I think it beat family.
Every time.
It was a little bit worrying, but yeah, and so I just find it difficult when people not only show that they don't have that integrity or don't display it, it's when other people then justify it. And what we've seen, I think, on news items in the last few weeks, not just this last week, is people being rolled on to defend something that's not really defendable, and for me, lose all their own personal integrity in doing that.
I think also, I don't know how, there are times, aren't there, Phil, when you basically want your senior leader, the most senior leader in the organisation, just to front it up. And I think there are occasions when, fairly junior people have been asked to front up for a senior member, and the impact that has, I think, within the body of the staff, shall we say, putting it back into a school setting, is in effect, when the going gets tough, the boss is not there. I mean, that's the fear, isn't it? It's a sort of little bit of a, I don't know, just a little bit of a feeling that this might all come down on me eventually if I get caught with it. But I'm not going to ask you, Phil, to say whether or not John's willing to front up the big issues in South Shore. Of course he is.
Well, of course he is, and this is the reason why. And I mean, I've asked him to come on a podcast with me, and that's the relationship that I've got of one of 12 schools, and a senior leader in just one of those has got a personal relationship with the CEO where I can pick up the phone. And, John, I mean, obviously I don't speak to John as often now because I was the DSL previously, and I was a DSL during a pandemic. So you talk about taking charge and fronting up and being visible and being available. They were all the things that we really had to do as a profession, particularly though in those challenging times. And John was always there, whether he was in a train station or wherever he would be on a Friday afternoon for those calls. So yeah, I would absolutely say that he did. And just on a little side note on that, if we can, on the report, I mean, I'm linking it back to my point, obviously, but I was interested in terms of, we want to kind of, and I've got the right line here about citizenship. So we wanted to kind of expand and develop work on citizenship. And is that kind of speaking to the fact that some of those, British values, dare we say, have not been front and center quite as much as maybe they should have been. And perhaps this is a reaction to that, but that was largely missed, I felt, in the Blunkett report. There wasn't much focus on that because that would be, linked to what we're talking about now.
Yeah, good point. Stan, you were going to mention the 12 education secretaries we've had.
Yeah, I suppose it follows the same argument that we're talking about stability as well as integrity. And education needs a long-term plan. Things don't change rapidly. We don't do that. And if you've got 12 education secretaries in 10 years and 6 in 1 year, how can there be a long-term view and a long-term policy if as appears to be happening, policies change with the new secretary? I just find it really disappointing that there's not, some sort of continuity over these last few months. We could have made this a statement that we're not changing because we need some longer term view.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's affecting quite a lot of the work I'm trying to do with John and South Shore, to be honest, where we're trying to develop a sort of digital strategy which will require some investment from government, but nothing's happening. At this moment in time, there's a meeting coming up, but actually we should be much further on in taking this project forward. But we've just been stymied by political unrest, and the sad thing is that it is some of the weakest, some of the poorest members of our communities that are facing this. We deal with this at the strategic level and trying to secure funding, but actually while we're faffing around doing all this sort of stuff, then actually the poor students, pupils, the families, they're not getting the support they need. And so in a way I feel for civil servants who are trying to manage all of this. I think, John, we have seen, I've been at the DFE when a new minister has been presented. I assume in various government roles you've seen similar things. How does it feel?
So the big gathering where the new ministerial team come in, or the new Secretary of State, and they stand in the cafeteria addressing the entire staff in this kind of atrium. And there were a few changes when I was there, one every couple of maybe 3, 4, 5 years. And it is an important time because, of course, you also have to prepare briefings for people coming in, and they need to know what the status quo is in order to know how they're going to take their work forward. So it creates that change in and of itself, creates additional work. But I actually used to love those occasions because there was an air of excitement about something new and what would be the emphasis for this person. But I guess the novelty wears off.
When you've had 6 in how many weeks?
Absolutely.
And also the temptation is just to print off the briefing that you did before.
Well, quite. And it took me back to a conversation I had, and I was working briefly in New York on Long Island, and I was there on President's Day, where all the schools closed. So just like here, they had a teacher day. So all of the staff from the school district, which was only about 4 schools in this case, but very large schools. So they all gathered for this teacher day, and the new superintendent spelt out his vision, and they had a special guest, one, well-known, renowned researcher in America. And the teachers all seemed fairly sort of nonplussed by this. And at the coffee break, I said to one of them, well, what do you think about this new pedagogical approach? And they said, oh, he'll be gone soon. Don't worry, he's ambitious. He'll be gone. It's kind of, let's sit it out. This new superintendent here, this is his thing, but we'll listen to it. We'll listen to all this stuff, but, they'll be gone soon and we'll get on with what really matters.
Well, talking about something
that's the classic resistance to change, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
Having worked in local authorities for most of my career, I've seen so many restructures, and those people who've been in it long enough now, just keep your head down. It'll all pass. We'll be back to where we were. That's why you'll know the change graph that everybody shows, where I've never seen anybody at that far end where you're smiling and happy and everything is nice. I mean, statistically, it'll be true because the people that they're interviewing there are the ones who've survived it. They're not interviewing the redundant ones. But I've just never felt I've ever got to that end. Somewhere down in the valley, somebody's brought another change in, and there's been another change and another change. So yeah, I just think there's a passive resistance that is, and I think the same's in schools. When you're trying to get culture change into schools, you've got to recognise that those that have a lot of influence, although they may be quiet, those are the ones whose mindset you've got to change in order that the culture can move forward.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny talking about change. What's caught my eye was Nick Gibb coming back as a minister in the. I think my first dealings with Nick Gibb were somewhere around 2010, I think it might have been. when we were sort of trying to introduce a new school inspection framework, and he was all over it, as you can imagine. He was really into the detail of it. But I have to say that conversation I had with him then, and a couple I've had since, it's quite an, I think in a way it probably goes back to the point you're making, Phil, that you can pick out 1 or 2 points that this individual has made, take that in isolation. Actually, you can sort of create some sort of, I won't say monster, but some sort of vision of what this person is actually, what you think they're like, or the vision you want to promote. But actually, with Nick Gibb, I think is a much more nuanced individual than that, than sort of the simple sort of caricature that there is of the minister. So I'm not sure I welcome him back, because it sort of suggests there's not really much talent in the talent pool around. But there are a number of new ministers, so let's be optimistic that this might produce a slightly better sort of way forward for us. Okay, so. I think we're on to room 101. So, Phil, Stan and I have no idea. John has no idea what you're going to put in. We had the government last week, so they're already in. Well, that was last week's government, shall I say. What's going in room 101 this week?
I'm glad you've asked, Frank. And for those watching, I'm not used to being on camera, by the way. As you can see, I've got a face for radio, so I'm quite used to just being...
I'm impressed, because actually the guitar is there, and if you move it up, there's a nice amp. And this is not you, though, is it?
No, this is Child One, as I call him on the podcast, who is currently using most of my bandwidth here on the internet, playing something else down in the other bedroom. But yes, it's all his stuff. He's much better on the guitar than me. As Frank and I discussed off air, listener, we're very strictly rhythm guitar. We can play a little bit, wheeled out sometimes. Right, but what I was trying to say there is, if I could move the camera up a little bit, there's a picture of George Orwell on the wall. Which is an unusual thing to have. I'm quite the Orwell obsessive, I'm afraid. So John knows this. I've read everything, including Keep the Aspidistra Flying and Clergyman's Daughter, and every biography you can imagine. I think I got into this in some kind of Wigan link. I think that was it. I started reading The Road to Wigan Pier.
So you're not going to put up George Orwell in room 101?
No. That was just the preface while I think about what I'm going to put into room 101. I was just John knows.
I'm just thinking how your lessons are running here, Phil. I'm just thinking, I'm not quite sure what the next bit is, so we'll go and have a chat about George Orwell.
Exactly, and of course now we can do that, can't we, in the new creative curriculum? I'm okay with that. That can just carry on. But I'm going to put in, it's controversial, I'm going to put in non-teaching SLT into room 101.
Wow, yeah.
Ooh. And this is something that I bang on about continuously, and obviously John knows this, and obviously there are arguments for and against. I understand that head teachers are much more than head teachers now in terms of everything else that they have to do, but I would like to see anyone who has any kind of senior leadership responsibility have a pupil facing position. And it's a chapter in the book, he says, second shameless plug we've done already, about all teachers should teach. So non-teaching SLT, wearing high vis, as John knows, and with radios, actually should spend some time in the classroom. And actually it'll be beneficial to you and it'll be beneficial to the children, because I said this before on the podcast quite a lot. When I was in charge of behaviour and you had to teach some classes, sorry, that's a bad phrase, isn't it? You taught some classes.
You had to teach classes.
Yes, I know. Yeah, God forbid. Had to teach. I was teaching classes. You had to live within your own behaviour policy, and you couldn't just say, "Well, I'm the deputy head teacher, therefore you need to do what I say." It was like, right, here's a policy that all the teachers need to live within, and I need to live within that. And also in the current position that I've got in terms of teaching and learning, I'm looking to try and develop my own practice. And when we talked on Friday, we're very lucky. We had a full day devoted to professional learning and appraisal, which is something that we do as a school and a trust. And, you can say, well, I acknowledge that I am not, as you've just seen, listener, I am not the best teacher. I can develop, and we use that Dylan William quote about, it's not because I'm not good enough, but because I can be even better. And if I can develop as a teacher and the students and other teachers can see that, then surely that is beneficial. So room 101 for non-teaching SLT.
Yeah, interesting,
Phil. I think it's also there's a bit about other teachers' expectations of SLT, because I know when I became a head, I quite often used to cover classes, and even sort of a month into not being a classroom teacher but being a head, the staff would say, "Are you sure you're okay taking this class? Are you sure you've got?" you can do that. Yes, I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 15 years. You know, I
Oh,
can do that.
Stan, these are the conversations I've on the corridor recently. So, I mean, John knows this, and there was a legitimate reason why we came out of the classroom, because you're the DSL in a school, and we've gone through everything we've gone through, partial closures, pandemic, etc. So that's understandable that you might have a slight sabbatical. And now we're allowed those, aren't we, as well? We can have,
Oh, yeah.
I'll be putting my claim into John for a year off very shortly.
Yeah, but it's coming through by email now.
Yeah. Just be careful, Phil, how quickly they give you that year off. That's more than you think.
Well, I think if it's every 5 years, I'm owed at least 4 years off, aren't I? That'll be quite good. So, you know, in fact, I could have retired by then, so that could be good, couldn't it? But, you know, just to echo what Stan's saying there, you know, the students will, when I'm standing on the corridor outside of a science lab, will go, "You teaching?" And I'll say, "Oh, yeah." "Oh, what are you teaching?" I say, well, science. What else? What else am I teaching? "Are you sure?" I say, "Well, no, I've got a science. I've actually got a biology degree and everything." You know, you don't think that you kind of ascended to these positions through not ever being in a classroom, but there is that assumption that the more senior you are in an organization, the less you have to do what everybody else does, and you just, I know it's a caricature to say, patrol corridors in high vis with a radio and do duty. I think it's crucial that people are in classrooms. And actually, do you know what, listener and viewer, you're going to enjoy it. You're going to enjoy being back in there. That's the thing. You know, I mean, I've not been a head teacher. I'm not, you know, I can't talk about what that's like, Stan, but surely that might be one of the easier and nicer parts of your day, actually being in front of children doing what you came into the job for in the first place.
I think
Definitely was. You've just got to choose. You've just got to choose what supply you're covering. I used to like to do PE and things because there wasn't a lot of preparation and write-ups and marking and everything else with it.
Yeah, I had a term of teaching year 4 in the summer when I was ahead. That was full time, and that nearly saw me off, to be honest. I have to say, you know, because loads of other things didn't happen. But I do agree with you, Phil. And the point I wanted to make was around, there's a growing number of primary schools where there are non-teaching deputies as well, and I suppose I'm not so critical of that, or I'm trying to sit on the fence there, because actually I'm not currently ahead. You know, I don't know what the budget situation is for those schools, but for me, you know, going back to the days when I was ahead, that you were lucky if the deputy had like even a day, not, you know, non-contact time. And I know that there is discussions going on about the proliferation of teaching assistants. I know they're looking at that. The government looking at in terms of cost savings and things like this, you know. So, you know, I think it probably is a need for some sort of general sort of review of, you know, what are these roles, and if it came down to it, which ones would have to change and which ones would go. I suppose that's a job that CEOs do all the time, John, isn't it? Really, I suppose. Sadly.
It is, but it is interesting just hearing what Phil was saying. So last term, a very experienced deputy in our trust, a very large school, got a headship, and one of the pieces of advice that her head teacher gave her was, have some teaching, do some teaching, and for all the reasons Phil said, and she said, it will be your sanity. In everything else that's going on, it will remind you. And this person that I'm talking about is head of a very large, very complex organization, and she teaches. She has an A-level class. And she said, you know, that's her sanity. That's when she feels that she's in her element, because it's what she went in to do. And yes, she does all those other things for most of the time, but actually remembers that, you know, that engagement with students, that engagement with the curriculum, that notion of having to make real the things that you've made decisions about in the classroom. All have to be lived out when you carry on doing that teaching. And it was interesting, that was her one piece of advice to her colleague, do teaching. Right,
John, what's in room 101 for you?
So for me, it's Avanti West Coast is going I don't think it'll ever get there, but but that's, you know, I'm a person who was a very, very regular user of the West Coast line, traveling from Piccadilly to London on a very regular basis. And recently, I was having to go to London for something else, nothing to do with work. I couldn't book a ticket in advance. I couldn't guarantee if I stayed overnight, I could get back. I couldn't get back on the same day. It's really bringing everything to a grinding halt, not to mention all the other rail companies in the north. That in particular, that's what I know about. It may be happening elsewhere, that are really at the moment sort of crippled and on their knees. And of course, people are talking about the strikes, nothing to do with that. Actually, they're on their knees when there isn't any industrial action. And I just think, people haven't realized the impact it's having. It's having an impact on the economy, but it's also having an impact on people's kind of thinking about things. So I've just been invited to go to something in London just before Christmas. It's something really good, really, exciting to do some other work that I do. And my first thought was not, oh, that's great. It was, when is it? If I go on a Wednesday, will I be able to get back on the third? You shouldn't be thinking like that in 2022 about the links between a major industrial city in the north and the capital. It should be much more smooth.
Well,
much more.
Yeah. Imagine trying to invest. If you're a southern business wanting to bring staff up north into the northwest, the last thing you want is them coming back to you and saying, "Well, I can't get home."
Yeah. Well,
you put me in Manchester, I can't get home from a family who are living in Guildford.
Exactly. Tracy Brabin, the mayor in West Yorkshire, was on the news this morning, and she said, "I came last night because I was too scared to come this morning, knowing that the train could be cancelled at very short notice." So I'm picking on Avanti West Coast because that's the one that I use most, but I could go for a few other train connections in the north.
Great. Well, thank you.
Does it regularly run to room 101, John?
That's what I said.
Or have those been cancelled?
Well, thank you, gents. That's well over 40 minutes, so it's a long edition. So some really interesting stuff, and I'm very grateful, Phil, for your time. And one final plug for Naylor's Natter. I've got it here somewhere. I can only find it, but there it is, available from all good books shops and. Well worth reading. And John, thanks for your time. And
pleasure.
I'll see you next week, Stan. So all being well. So thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.